This is the second part of the invited address I was to give at the Parapsychological Association meeting on August 3rd, 2018. I've recorded the first half of it as a separate video, and if you've already listened to that, the second part will make a lot more sense. It's possible this part might stand on its own, but the previous stuff will enrich it. So the title is Toward Putting the Psyche Back into Psychology, toward developing a science of mind. And now in developing a science of mind, I want to move toward what we would generally call the spiritual. Now, I know that's a terrible word because it's associated with all sorts of craziness, as well as some of the highest and most noblest aspects of human life, but I don't have a better word, and I'm not up to making some neologism to make it sound scientific. We'll have to develop that over a long period of time. In the first lecture, I argued for creation of a mental chemistry where experience itself is one of the elements we observe, and we learn to observe it more deeply by developing remote viewing, which has been so successful in observing the outside world, into observing inner processes in people, including possibly subconscious processes. I think doing this will make parapsychology a major part of many scientific disciplines, like inventing a microscope or a telescope or something like that. Here I want to talk about moving toward using the rigorous methodology of parapsychology to begin to investigate the spiritual, hopefully in a somewhat scaled down manner that won't be too weird and far out and scare people off. So, as I asked in the first part, take a trip with me. Like physicists who've often made breakthroughs after pursuing an idea because it's interesting. Don't get all caught up in, is it practical, where would we get the resources, stuff like that. But, well, if this is true, where will it take it? But maybe we could go this way and it would work even better. And besides, it's complicated. I need you younger folks to help figure that out. Okay, I got interested in this by reading about out-of-the-body experiences. While I was still a teenager, as shown in the next slide, I read a book called The Projection of the Astral Body by Sylvan Muldoon and Herwood Carrington. Sylvan Muldoon was the man having the out-of-the-body experiences. Herwood Carrington was a psychical researcher who'd already investigated a wide variety of things. And I think in this particular book, he mainly helped Muldoon write it up clearly. Muldoon, while still a teenager, went to a religious camp meeting with his mother. Back at the time this happened, there were lots and lots of religious camp meetings all over America. And one night he just happened to have an out-of-the-body experience, or as he called it, an astral projection, a starry movement out, something like that, astral projection. His mother was a spiritualist, although a lot of Americans were spiritualists back then, so he didn't get too weirded out by the thing that was happening. In the book, he took what I think is a highly sensible attitude about this. He said, look, I know most people will think the idea of an astral projection or out-of-the-body experience is totally insane, and I don't expect you to believe me. But this is what happened to me. I'll try to describe it as accurately as possible, and if you find it interesting, give it a try. Here's some methods that might help you actually have such an out-of-the-body experience. If it works for you, fine. If not, and you want to continue thinking I'm some kind of crazy, it's all right. I understand. He had an artist sketch how an out-of-the-body experience happened for him. That's shown in the next slide. For Muldoon, he would become partially awake and feel like his body was paralyzed, and then as if some force gradually lifted his real self up till it was floating parallel to his body a few feet in the air, and then usually move off down toward the foot of the bed, and about the time he was standing on the floor in his second body. The paralysis disappeared. He was fully awake, and he was able to experiment on what this state was like, go to various places, and so forth. He also perceived a little silver cord connecting his out-of-the-body body and his physical body. Whether that really exists or whether that's the fact that the silver cord was a biblical analogy that was well known at the time, I don't know. So he was having an out-of-the-body experience. Now, I find that people use the term out-of-the-body experience pretty sloppily in the literature. So I'll define it. Basically, an out-of-the-body experience means, one, you find yourself at a location other than where you know then your physical body is. But second, and this is the important part, you look at the functioning of your mind and it doesn't feel like it's fuzzy or you're in a dream or you're all weirded out. It feels like your mind is perfectly clear and rational. That's the out-of-the-body experience. There are, some fuzzier versions of it and so forth, but that's the essence of it. I started writing about out-of-the-body experiences, and I was a little too thorough on abbreviations. I called out-of-body experiences OOBEs, and the universe paid me back for being so semantically sloppy. Years later, as people started coming up to me and after lectures and saying, I had an UBE, let me tell you about my UBE. I never thought anybody would pronounce OOBE, but anyway. So that got me interested in that because the concept, or rather the experience of an out-of-the-body experience is one of the most important things that can happen to a human being, because almost invariably the reaction to it after it's over, and this may be a reaction that lasts a lifetime, it's not like a dream that you forget in a day. The reaction is usually something like, I don't believe that I'm going to survive death. I know I'm going to survive death. It's not a matter of belief. I've been out of my body and alive and fully conscious. And to us outsiders who haven't had the experience, that's somebody else's experience. But to the people who have it, it makes a tremendous difference in the way they view their world. It's where the concept of a soul came from, I'm sure. You can find ancient texts that indicate people having out-of-the-body experiences and so forth. Now, since the concept of a soul has been pretty central in most religions, it's important to understand what it's about. As something being researched, it's been almost totally unresearched for a long, long time. It's been a taboo topic in science. Lately, the last decade or so, there have been a few neurophysiological studies which I think have not really studied out-of-the-body experiences for the most part. They haven't had that full definition. The person is outside and their mind is perfectly clear. I can say I'm out of my body now. I've said the words, but I'm not. I'm right here as far as I can tell. So understanding it on its own terms and not just explaining it away is really important. I was very lucky early in my career to meet Bob Monroe. Bob was an out-of-the-body guy. I'll give you a little detail because some of my younger colleagues may not be that familiar with Bob. The next slide shows a picture of Bob and the cover of his first book, Journeys Out of the Body. Bob was born 1915, died 1995. His father was a college professor, his mother a doctor. He had a normal childhood. A lot of it during the Depression. He bummed around the country, rode the rails a while, ended up as a successful radio producer in New York. For those of you who are old enough to remember them, one of the radio shows he produced was The Shadow, who knew what evil lurked in the hearts of men. That was cool. By the time I met him in Charlottesville, the year I spent there at the University of Virginia, he owned a cable TV company, was a successful businessman, was a normal person by the standards of the community. He played poker, once a week, something like that, did the things that normal people do. I quickly recognized Bob as an honest person, okay? He was not somebody who was feeding his ego by thinking, wow, I'm special, I can leave my body and access spiritual teachings or something. He was quite puzzled by this thing and had been trying for years to understand them. I also found his attempts to describe them as accurately as possible, like Muldoon here, really valuable because he had not been exposed to any occult or spiritualist literature that said it's supposed to be like this. I did hypnosis research for years. I've been very impressed by the way the human mind can create a whole reality. And actually, we all do that all the time, and it's called being normal. But for some people, they can create very different ones. What you create is influenced by what you've been taught it should be. But Bob hadn't been biased in that particular way. He was genuinely puzzled by his out-of-the-body experiences, as I said, trying to understand them. And we had many interesting conversations over the years. I treated him as talented, not crazy. We had a long-term friendship because of many other common interests. Out-of-the-body experiences were not something he wanted. They just happened. And for a long time, he had written them up in that first book, but he was afraid of publishing them because he thought that people in the community would think he was really crazy. In fact, his out-of-the-body experiences were one of the reasons his first marriage broke up. But I had no doubt he was being honest about it, and he really wanted to understand them. I'm responsible for his first book being published. He had written up the book and sent it off to a literary agent in New York, and not heard a single word from that agent in the year since he had sent it off. I suspect the agent was too freaked out or thought this was too crazy for anybody to pay any attention to it. Doubleday had published the paperback version of my Altered States of Consciousness book then, and I knew one of the editors, Bill Whitehead, well, so I got a second copy of Bob's manuscript and sent it to Bill Whitehead. Bill Whitehead got it at the office, didn't have time to look at it just then, but took it home, figured he'd glance at it after dinner. He didn't think he was going to be interested in it because it looked kind of crazy to him, but he and I were friendly, so he couldn't stop reading it until about 3 o'clock in the morning when he came to the chapter on how to have an out-of-the-body experience. And he was afraid that if he read the chapter, he'd have an out-of-the-body experience, and he wasn't ready for that yet. Anyway, the book got published. I wrote the introduction for it. Bob has written 3 books now. They're shown in the next slide. Hundreds of thousands of copies all over the world have been sold in English and various translations. 25 different countries. Journeys Out of the Body still sells 7,000 to 10,000 copies a year in annual sales. And I think that's quite wonderful because so many people I've talked to who've spontaneously had out-of-the-body experiences have worried so much that there's something wrong with them, and Bob's book reassures them. Here's an ordinary person. These things happen. They're an ordinary person. It doesn't mean they're crazy. So what are Bob's out-of-the-body experiences like? Well, his first one happened in the spring of 1958. He had falling asleep while thinking about going gliding. Gliding was one of his hobbies. Sometime in the night he felt something poking into his back, which woke him up, and he thought he must have sleepwalked, although he wasn't a sleepwalker, so he opened his eyes and looked around, and there was this round thing in the middle of the wall that he was pushed back against, poking in the middle of his back. What in the world was that? He stepped forward a little to get a better look at it, and it was a light fixture. What's a light fixture doing in the middle of a wall? Except as he looked around more, the light fixture was in the middle of the ceiling where it belonged, and he was floating in the air there. He looked around. He saw his wife sleeping in bed. He saw some strange man sleeping beside her. Although as he looked more closely, that strange man looked more familiar. That was him. It started happening more and more. So Bob did what for our culture is the normal thing. He went to see his doctor to find out what was wrong with him and was there a cure. His doctor found nothing physically wrong with him and eventually said, why don't you take notes? Might be interesting. So the big issue for Bob was, were his out-of-the-body experiences real? Was this some special kind of dream, like a lucid dream where your mind is very clear but you're still in a dream world? But eventually he had several out-of-the-body experiences where he went to a distant place and was able to describe what went on at that place and describe it accurately, and that convinced him he wasn't crazy. He couldn't verify it most of the time, as he complained to me once. You're having an out-of-the-body experience. It lasts for 1 minute. You find you're on a strange street corner in a strange city at 3 o'clock in the morning and nothing's happening, and now you're back in your body. What's to check? Fortunately, he took notes. We can go back to the diagram of Muldoon's out-of-the-body experience, which is shown in the next slide there. Bob didn't have any silver cord, but for Bob, the experience usually began with a feeling of vibration in his body, and then he would float up out of his body and the experience would go on. He had hundreds and eventually thousands of out-of-the-body experiences over the years. Where did he go? He went to a lot of places which he presumed were somewhere here on Earth, even if he couldn't verify it. Locale 1, he called it. They were not like ordinary dreams. Again, Bob distinguished ordinary dreams and his occasional lucid dreams from his out-of-the-body experiences. They're nothing like each other. He went to some places that he called Locale 2, trying to come up with a neutral descriptive term. A lot of people would call them spiritual realms or heavenly realms or maybe hell realms in some cases. But to even begin to talk about them, you're getting into state-specific knowledge, which I have no mastery of and we can't even talk about here. But he went to a special place a number of times that he called Locale 3, which was enough like an objectively real physical world to intrigue him and to intrigue us, and potentially it could be verified. I mean, maybe it was on a planet somewhere else in the galaxy. So as soon as we developed our FTL drive, this is my little test to see how many of you read a lot of science fiction when you were younger and realized the FTL drive is the faster than light drive, which we'll need for adventuring around the galaxy. It's a cool acronym. Presumably, it's verifiable if we could go there. So what was this locale thing? And how did he get there? The next slide is a diagram I've created of Monroe's way of getting to Locale 3. One night he felt the vibrations, but he couldn't float up out of his body or seem to do anything. So he tried something novel. Still lying horizontally, he turned over from lying on his back to lying prone in his out-of-the-body body, his astral body, whatever you want to call it. And then he felt much freer, and he felt out with his hands, and there was a wall right above his head, and there was a hole in the wall. And he's a curious person. Eventually he reached through the hole, couldn't feel anything, and then the hole was big enough that he could pull himself through. And that's how he got to Locale 3. And it became a reliable way for him. He could set up the vibrations in his physical body, rotate 180 degrees along the long axis of his body, find that hole in the wall, and go through it. What was Locale like? Or, if we're going to ask a question about its reality, what is Locale 3 like? Interesting thing to think about. You know, I like that word, interesting. Locale 3 was a consistent place. Incidentally, the way Monroe distinguishes lucid dreams from places he thinks are real is that in lucid dreams he can make things happen just by wishing or willing for them to happen. Not in these other kinds of places. They run by their own laws. You've got to act in accordance with them. So Locale 3 was very like an ordinary physical world. There were trees and houses and cities, artifacts. People looked like ordinary people, wore clothes and so forth. They lived in homes, they had families and businesses, people seemed to work for a living. There were roads, there were vehicles for traveling on the roads, railroads and trains. And at first he thought, was he merely in some unknown part of Earth? Except Locale 3 was not like our physical world. For instance, he never saw anything that looked like an electrical device. No lights, no telephones, no radios, no TV, no electric power transmission. There was mechanical power units, but none of them looked like internal combustion engines. And Bob was into engines and cars and stuff like that, so he knew about engines. He once got to watch a locomotive refueling in a station. And one of the things that struck him was the locomotives there had a very narrow track width, narrower than our own narrow gauge railroads. And the refueling seemed to consist of workers very, very carefully removing vat-like containers from underneath the steam boiler and moving them into a very thick-walled sort of place and putting some new ones there. And Bob thought these look like people who are handling things that are either thermally very hot and could burn them, or maybe are radioactive or something, handling them with great care. That would be technically feasible, actually, to make a steam engine that worked on that kind of radioactivity. Probably pretty dangerous, but not. The roads in Locale 3 were twice as wide as our roads. The autos were much wider. Even the smallest auto that he observed had a bench seat that could seat 5 people abreast. Only the driver's seat was actually fixed, and there were movable chairs that could be scattered around in a space that looked like about 15 by 20 feet or something like that. They seemed to go maybe 15, 20 miles per hour, but there weren't any traffic lights. The tires didn't look like they were inflated. They were steered by a horizontal bar rather than a steering wheel. And Monroe flew planes as well as gliders, had been a race car driver. He knew this extra wide design was crazy. I mean, you have to build your roads twice as big. You have more problems with the gears and with the differential when you make a turn with things that wide. That's really weird. The people in Locale 3 were not aware of Monroe until he started, quote, merging, unquote, with a particular person. And he came back for several visits, always merging with this particular person. Except that after a few visits, he realized that when he merged with this person, that person got kind of stupid and didn't know what to do in social situations very well. And so he was causing trouble for that person. So he stopped going to Locale 3. What was going on? Is Locale 3 something that is independently real, not just a subjective construction of Monroe's mind? Now, we're way out on the interestingness scale. That's all right. That'll give us something to think about. So, I want to propose how we could go about investigating Locale 3, and that starts out in our next slide. And that begins with building that investigating team again. Not remote viewers in this case, although that would be interesting to try to remote view that. This team you would build are people who can have out-of-the-body experiences reasonably at will, so you don't waste your time and nothing happens. And this is an extremely important and, you have to have people who know nothing about Monroe's accounts of Locale 3. Preferably no knowledge about Monroe and his out-of-the-body experiences at all. Because remember, again, my experience in studying hypnosis and other altered states, our minds can construct realities quite elaborate. We do one in a dream every night. And then, I think even our waking consciousness is actually a simulation of reality, a virtual reality that's constantly adjusting itself to the sensory input we're getting, okay? So if you try this with people who've already read Monroe's accounts of this, they might give you the same kinds of reports, but it might be just a subjective artifact. I would also include my important and to the experimenters, the laboratory staff, should also have no knowledge of what Monroe reported about locale 3. Okay, the next slide shows the second step in the investigation of locale 3. And basically, what's the minimum way to get people there? You can say, train them to feel vibrations, to rotate on that axis to the prone position, find a wall, and go through a hole. That's what I think is the minimal training. Whether that's sufficient for whatever locale 3 is, I don't know whether that's actually sufficient. But we have to be very, very careful about making anything more specific, because that will start giving cues as to what we expect people to find. So what's the minimal training to reach something like locale 3? I don't think, for instance, telling people to go through a hole in the wall is in any way going to suggest that cars should be twice as wide as usual. But there's a lot to be studied on that. If you can find people who will do that, and they begin to give you reports that are very much like Monroe's, what have we got? Have we got an independent reality that can be reached by the mind? Have we got some kind of telepathically distributed collective hallucination? It's going to be very interesting to find this out. So we might end up concluding, if it was studied for a while, that locale 3 might be experientially real for some individuals, but not for some others unless you cue them in a lot, and then you have to worry that you're just biasing them to artifactually create it. Or suppose, being as careful as we can not to bias them, we get very consistent results about locale 3. And then we can go to the blank slide now. Are we going to stop at locale 3? Or are we going to look at some of these other strange places that Bob Monroe has talked about? Heaven realms, spirit realms, and all that. Is it all imagination? Some of it certainly must be. We're people, we have the capacity to do that sort of thing. But is any of it, some of it, based on something more real? This is where parapsychological methods, which again have to be developed to be quite reliable, and remote viewing is on the way to that, can act as a tool in other areas for exploring a psychology of the mind. As I said in the first half of this lecture, we can develop, I think, a mental chemistry. We can deal with the problems in the early days of ignoring individual differences, experimenter bias, culture boundedness, and so forth, and we can learn a lot. And that's going to be very, very interesting. It's not going to be as cut and dried as the physical sciences. Water, as I said, is always dihydrogen monoxide. Be more probabilistic, but that's going to be very interesting. Do we need help in developing this? Oh, yes. That's my almost final slide there. We could use all the help we can get, and maybe the Beatles will provide us with as much help as the neurophysiologist at some point. But seriously, parapsychology, I think, can be a foundational science to transpersonal psychology in the same way that physics and chemistry, those basic physical sciences, are foundational sciences for engineering. Engineering may want to build such and such a thing. The physics or the chemists may say, no, I'm sorry, the materials won't handle that kind of thing. Parapsychology may be able to say eventually, such and such is something that human minds can do under some conditions. Maybe that could be part of some sort of spiritual reality. Other parts of this, no, we can't see how that would work. There's no evidence for it or something like that. So I've sketched a slide showing parapsychology as a foundation for investigating a science of the mind and perhaps for spirituality. And I've put spirituality in kind of faintly because I know the idea of spirituality freaks some people out, and there's so much irrational clash between science and religion that some parapsychologists think we must act as if there is absolutely no spiritual meaning to psychic phenomena at all in order to find acceptance in the mainstream scientific world. I don't think that approach is going to get us anywhere. Reality is reality. It is what it is. So my final slide, it may be that this is going to deal much more with whatever spirituality is than we think it does. I'm not going to say how, because I don't know. Now, people wouldn't be at a convention of the Parapsychological Association if you weren't devoted to wanting more truth about the way reality is. And in terms of my own view of the world, that's actually a spiritual attitude in a sense. To use our intelligence to get a clearer and clearer understanding of what the world is, as well as developing the intelligence of our hearts, of course, is something that I think is profoundly spiritual. So we're curious, we're skeptical, we're not satisfied with current explanations. We know, for instance, that standard physical explanations so far simply don't explain psychic phenomena, and yet a number of psychic phenomena happen. And yes, there's promissory material in which says physics and chemistry will explain it eventually, but eventually is an unfalsifiable proposition. I think it'll be explained in terms of little purple men in green flying saucers eventually. Can't disprove that statement either. So I think we need to investigate these things on their own merits in terms of their own stuff. We recognize the power of scientific collaboration. We recognize that collaboration may have to be unconventional at times. We're also very brave people coming to the Parapsychological Association thing, much less working in the field, because of all the crap we have to put up from the pseudo-skeptics. Really. So much of my career has been wasted dealing with the irrational and ignorant attacks from those people. But I think another job requirement of being a parapsychologist is that you have to be stubborn, and we're pretty stubborn. So we can make that progress. The future's going to be very interesting. Thank you for listening.